Greetings, kia ora. Welcome to Baha'i on Air. I'm Shar Mahon, and we're here at Baha'i Summer School with our special guest from Australia, Faya Hayati.
Thank you.
Faya you're an economist.
Yes.
And you work for the Department of Treasury.
Yes.
Australia.
Yes, that's right.
What brings you to New Zealand?
I'm here to attend the New Zealand Baha'i Summer Schools, both in Auckland and in Christchurch.
Thank you for joining us. I actually had the pleasure of attending one of your talks.
Ah, yes.
Yes, is it your first time in New Zealand?
No, actually I've been here 3 times before, and North and South Island. And actually the last time I was here I travelled through South Island, and it's truly beautiful, probably the most beautiful landscape and visuals I've ever seen in the world. And yes, New Zealand has a special place in my heart.
And you've come with your wife, and
Yes, that's right. We've both packed our bags and come over here for the summer, and going to spend a couple of weeks here.
Faya, tell us a little bit about your background. Where are you from and where were you born?
Sure, I currently live in Canberra in Australia, and I grew up in Australia, but I was actually born in India. My parents moved to study in India from Iran, and my dad got a job at the Baha'i temple in India, and he was working there for 5 years, and I popped out, and then we moved to Australia. And yeah, so now I've pretty much grown up there my entire life.
You're a Baha'i, Faya,
Yeah.
and your parents are from Iran.
Mm-hmm.
There is a lot of persecution of Baha'is in Iran at the moment. In what ways are the Baha'is being persecuted?
Since the beginning of the faith in 1844, many Baha'is have been subject to persecution, with many of them having lost their lives, some 20,000 members. But today the forms of persecution have evolved. The government of Iran at the moment has particularly waged a strong campaign about denying education to the young, and is quite prohibitive in how a Baha'i can practice in Iran. And there are also some forms of this persecution in other parts of the world, particularly in Egypt as well. But you know, these persecutions have very little affected the spirit of the Baha'is in Iran, and the rest of the world looks at the way that the Baha'is of Iran have endured this persecution, and it's an example for many of us who are very disconnected from Iran, but very much connect to their suffering and to their enthusiasm.
So you've talked at a summer school in Hamilton, in New Zealand, and soon in the South Island. And what is the theme of your talk?
Well, I guess it's hard to capture in a sentence, but primarily what I'm trying to look at is any follower of any religion will always have a set of standards which their religion tries to infuse into every believer. And in the Baha'i faith, it's no different. In fact, the standard of what is required of an individual is quite high. It's quite lofty. And the struggles for an imperfect person like myself and you is that we have to somehow move and focus our life to persevere to attain these standards. And as a Baha'i, we focus on 2 parts of our life. We have we certainly believe in the spiritual form of life, and the purpose of life is divine. And we try to pursue a life which tries to develop our spiritual sides, looking at our values and our virtues, our morality and our character. But an equally important part of Baha'i life is how we serve and contribute the rest of mankind. The Baha'i faith is a firm believer that while you must build and develop our inner being, we have an equal responsibility to contribute to the development of the world. So I guess the talk was trying to look at this standard which has been put to us by Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, and how we can strive to implement this standard in both our daily life and also our broader life to contribute to humanity.
You can feel it in the air. I haven't lived for long, but I can certainly say something is happening. People are wanting to discuss themes which they usually don't want to. Whether it be an economic crisis, spiritual crisis, emotional crisis, the world is in a clear example that it does not know how to deal with itself.
So you're an economist.
Yes.
And you're working for the Department of Treasury. yet you're talking about us being spiritual beings.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's not the common conversation we have at the Treasury, particularly right now with the world's financial crisis. But, it's interesting because we are, as you say, I come from a very rigid science of economics, but particularly in the events that are occurring in the world right now with, the housing crisis in the US, which has now spread systemically throughout the world, the rest of the world is beginning to question these rigid beliefs we've had about consumerism and about the way we run our economy. And you'd be surprised how even in these circles, such as economics, people are beginning to question, well, perhaps we need to reevaluate our systems that support, extremes of wealth and try to encourage capitalism to an extent which might isolate and alienate people from the system. And I think the world is beginning to realize that there was a lot of greed and self-interest that has driven us to the state we are now. So surprisingly, there's a lot of opportunities, even in an economic context, to discuss some of these spiritual values that society might be struggling with.
Is, I guess, the populist opinion out there, maybe less now, like you said, that people are becoming more receptive to their spiritual side, given the troubles in the world. Populist opinion is that religion is the cause of strife. Therefore, is it enough just to be a good person and to do good things, but not subscribe to any religion?
It's a very interesting question. And, I think people are right to think that religion has been the cause of, so many problems and to be suspicious. But I think when you step back from a lot of these situations which people recall, you can see that it's the furthest thing that religion has ever asked for, to divide and disunify mankind. If you look a bit closer, often you can see that the differences do not arise from religious scripture or from the beliefs of Islam or Judaism or Christianity, but rather it's often the people have been corrupted by their own pursuits of power or have failed to really embrace the values of their own religion, and this has led to conflict. And your question goes, your follow-up question was, well, what about a world which has now become impatient with religion, and should they seek refuge in their own beliefs and put aside religion? As a Baha'i, I guess we believe that religion is the light which will shine the world, and with it comes a divine revelation from God, and this revelation emerges through time. So with Christ, he brought his revelation; with Muhammad, and now with Baha'u'llah, God brings us a new set of writings. And in the Baha'i faith, there's a lot of writings focused on the development of mankind. And some of the principles which Baha'is around the world are trying to implement is things from the true equality of men and women, and the trying to remove the disparity which exists in the world in both economic and material means, and even things to the environment. And these are all principles which begin in our faith. So I think that religion has a lot to offer in the solutions to some of the problems that the world is currently experiencing.
So the principles you mentioned, like the equality of men and women and so on, are principles. What activities are the Baha'is involved in making these principles more real in the grassroots, if you like?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, because the Baha'i faith is quite a large organization to some extent. It's a faith which has many different arms, and it has an international focus which works very closely with the United Nations, and on that level it does a lot of work to advance some of these themes. But really, where the Baha'i faith makes its impact is, as you said, on the grassroots. It has really thought about where a lot of the problems which exist in the world, the disenfranchisement, the disconnection with spirit. And for example, Baha'is believe that there's a lot of work that can be done with children and junior youth. And Baha'is all around the world have programs which have been developed and worked on throughout the past few decades, which look at empowering children and junior youth and really trying to engender a high standard, a spirit within them which they can take into their adulthood. And these courses, which run for different ages and for different parts of the world, look at how to prepare a junior youth for the world which they will embrace. And for the adults, there's a lot of courses which exist looking at the true reality of man. And I find that in this world that we live, it's very easy to become swept up in our pursuits and our daily lives and lose focus. And, you know, as a Baha'i and as most religions, religions really try to bring out the inner reality of man, and that's his divine reality, his spiritual being. And one of the courses which the Baha'i faith runs, Reflections on the Life of the Spirit, tries to focus man back to his inner being. And how do we feed our soul? How do we develop and focus on our inner being in a world which is constantly trying to move us towards our outer being and our material desires and our material needs? So I guess in the grassroots, the Baha'i faith is trying to bring this consciousness and awareness, and it's doing this through the writings of Baha'u'llah.
And during the summer school, I saw that you were talking to young people about similar themes that you had discussed now. What response have you been getting from the youth regarding the topics that you talk about them being essentially spiritual rather than physical and material beings?
Right. The youth at the summer school are fantastic, and you know, they all have a wonderful spirit in them. And you know, I often think that the challenges which the world is experiencing, the youth almost have a greater potency of that challenge, because the adults have the ability and the benefit of having wisdom and a greater hardening in their standards. But as youth, it's quite challenging to really live up to one's sets of beliefs when you're in such a formative period of your life. And when you look at what the youth are going through today, it's very different and much more difficult than what even my generation, 10 years ago experienced in high school, and certainly my parents' generation. And for a youth these days, they live in a society in which at every opportunity is trying to question their beliefs and trying to pressure them to pursue a life which they might not necessarily accept, but society accepts. And society often tries to impose a normality in falling short of the standards, whether it be with drugs or whether it be, flagrant with promiscuity or, engaging in activities which really compromise the character of youth. And when I was speaking with the youth, it was trying to look at, well, this is the world we've inherited. There is no point in whinging that we live in this climate. The challenge is, how do we arise to the standards which Baha'u'llah has asked us to arise to, whilst not removing ourselves from society? Because as Baha'is, we must engage in the society in which we're trying to help. And there's no point in removing yourself so as you can, not partake of its difficulties. That's the challenge of being an individual in this society. And there were some really fruitful and consultative points that we've discussed about. And I think this is the challenge that the youth of this day face.
And I recall you saying about their purpose of serving humanity. And how do they respond to that?
Yeah, I think Baha'is in general, and particularly so the youth, really share responsibility in trying to alleviate some of the world's problems. As Baha'is, we feel that Baha'u'llah has provided the sovereign remedy to a lot of the world's problems. And we feel that it is our duty to try as much as we can to afford the opportunity to others around us to view these remedies and see for themselves if they will assist them in the struggles they go for. And the guardian of the Baha'i faith, who was the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, said that this is a religion which belongs to the youth. And I think when he said that, he was referring to the great potential and the great capacity of the youth to really lead a faith into new frontiers. And it's been a characteristic of the history of the Baha'i faith that it has always been the youth which have, really taken the standards and taken the work of the faith to a new level. And the youth at this conference in Hamilton, I think, felt that spirit, and they feel that responsibility to not only refine their own characters and maintain their own morality, but to really serve humanity, serve their friends, and find a way to instill this spirit and this pursuit of happiness, true happiness, amongst their friends and their colleagues.
You talked about the Junior Youth Empowerment Program before, you mentioned that. Do you have to be a Baha'i to partake in these programs or classes?
Yeah, not at all. The Baha'i faith is very open, and the fundamental principle, if you could boil down about the Baha'i faith, is the unity of mankind. And it adopts this approach in everything it does. To build a world, you must build it with everyone, not with just Baha'is or just with New Zealanders or just with Hamiltonians, if that's a category. So these programs, Junior Youth and the Reflections of Life of the Spirit for the adults, are actually aimed at trying to bring together these different thoughts, from Baha'is to Muslims, to Christians, to those who are agnostic or those who don't even believe in God. There's a merit in all of us sitting down in a room and discussing what the writings say about the spiritual reality of man. So it's certainly not at all restricted to Baha'is.
Faya, you and your wife are certainly an example of what you talked about before, about the premise of the Baha'i faith being about unity of the races, because you've married, what is her background? What is Anisa's background?
Yeah, Anisa is, she's quite the fruit salad. She was born in Zambia. Her father is Kenyan, her mother is Persian, and she grew up in country Australia. So she finds it difficult to identify with any one of those upbringings. But I think in her heart she's probably more Australian than any other culture. But it's very difficult to draw out, and she very much considers herself a world citizen. And yeah, so she's married an Indian-born, Australian-living, Persian background person. So I don't know what that will make our kids, but
like you said, a fruit salad.
Yes, perhaps.
What is the purpose of Baha'i Summer School?
Summer School is a fantastic event that happens through most of the world, where Baha'is come together during their holidays. And really it's a time where you bring your partners or your children, and it's a family event. And of course those who aren't part of family come as well. And it's a time when really it's about community building and reconnecting with that spirit, where you spend your days primarily occupied in three things. That's study, where you look at the writings of Baha'i faith, or you hear speakers talk about particular themes and principles in Baha'i faith. Devotion, which is this concept where you communicate through very different artistic forms, whether it be, you watch other people do a performance, or you study and you pray together in a reverent form. And this is a really interesting part of summer school, where you don't often have time during the normal day to put aside this much time to just devote and to participate in that sort of communication. And then the final part of summer school, which a lot of the youth particularly enjoy, is the recreation, where we run around, play sports, and it's this wholesome event where it really lends itself to all parts of your education, whether it be material, spiritual, and even physical. And summer school is a time of the year which most of the Baha'is, and including those from the community who aren't Baha'is, often look forward to, and it's a great way to start the new year.
You mentioned that there are different forms of education, material, spiritual, and physical.
Yeah.
Do you think perhaps that the problems in the world today, the turmoil that is happening, is to do with the focus of education being on one or two rather than all three aspects that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that there is something lacking. In the Baha'i writings, it's said that man is a mine, and it's full of gems. And the only way which man's capacity can become availed is through education. And education has this ability to raise a generation of people and really fulfill their purpose. And today, I think, looking at my own education, whether it be from tertiary to even primary and high school, there's a very strong focus on the intellectual side, which is critical for man's intellectual rigor and reasoning, but it's not complete. And when I look back at my 12 years of high school and primary school, I cannot recall a single session which focused on, what about morality? What about our character? How do we develop these things, our ethics. And these are, I think most people would agree, fundamental parts of who we are as people, but at least in the formal education, it's not present. And I guess there's an assumption that this belongs in the home. And I think it does belong in the home, but it should be an equal part of society in its formal structures. And, you know, ethics and morality aren't unique to one religion. And you can very much educate people in these forms without imposing anyone's view. And I think you can link so many of the world's problems to a fundamental lack of education. Even the crises which occur in my field, which is economics and financial crises, they have a very strong connection to the most basic principles. And you know, one of the Baha'i principles, for example, is about moderation in all things. And in economics, the first thing that they teach you is that it's about trying to match unlimited wants with limited resources. And this fundamental principle which drives the economics of all governments and all economies is something which I think, when you boil it down, has a friction with such a basic value. Why should I have unlimited wants? Why should I demand everything and demand that I have every need satisfied? And when you reduce it back to modesty and moderation, that perhaps I don't need that third iPod, or I need every form of this series. Instead, perhaps this resource would be better expended in dealing with poverty. And I guess the broader point I'm trying to say is education in the most fundamental form is the problem, well, the lack of education is the problem to many of the world's problems.
And what generation Baha'i are you?
Well, my father was a Baha'i, and his father was also a Baha'i. My mother wasn't. She comes from a Muslim background, and she's actually, her family is royalty. In two dynasties ago in Iran, the Raja dynasty, my mother is a member of that family, and her great-grandfather's uncle was the king of Iran. And she, obviously, in that culture, was Muslim, but she investigated the faith, and when she was about 25, she made the decision to become Baha'i. So I'm a bit of a mix. I've got both of that in my blood.
Did you reach that decision at some point in your life to become a Baha'i, or was it automatically assumed by your parents that you would become a Baha'i?
No, and you know, I think this is probably one of for me anyway, one of the greatest aspects of the Baha'i faith. Baha'u'llah says that every individual must independently investigate the truth of this religion and must come to a decision with no influence from anyone else. And why I really appreciate this is, as a child of two Baha'i parents, having them subscribe to that belief meant that they provided me with an education which was complete. They taught me about Hinduism, they taught me about Judaism, they taught me about the Baha'i faith. And the Baha'i faith believes that someone reaches the age of maturity at 15 years old, and that at that point they have the intellectual and the spiritual ability to make a decision about what their religion should be. And what parents do in the Baha'i faith is they try to build the capacity of a child to make that decision. And that means both informative, trying to provide them resources to educate all religions, but also I'm very grateful for my parents trying to instill spiritual insight, trying to, I guess, develop the capacity to have an ability to look at things and see a greater purpose in them, not just the material aspect of it. And when I came to 15, I was very much looking forward to the time when I would be recognized as an adult, or as an older person, not just a child. And I made the decision then, independently of anyone else, that I would want to be a Baha'i.
What made you decide to work for the Australian Treasury?
Well, I've always been interested in an analytical framework to look at issues. And at university, I studied law and economics, and I've felt that I much preferred the science of economics than law, because it did subscribe to almost a rigid way of looking at things. But at the same time, I've always had a compelling or a calling to want to contribute to humanity and try to deal with some of its problems. And I just completed my Master's in International and Economic Development, and I hope to try to translate the the learnings I'm doing at the Treasury and in my degrees, to somehow look at the real problem which is facing so many people in this world, which is economic instability, which is a world which cannot afford to provide the basic necessities to children and to families. And I want to see if there is a way which we can rebalance the economic framework to look favorably on this situation and try to alleviate some of these problems. So I guess that's why I've started in economics, is to get to that field.
You mentioned that education, including spiritual education, is the responsibility of both parents. Is it the responsibility more of the father or the mother?
I should get them to answer that. But in the Baha'i view on education is that it does belong to the parents. And it's interesting because I wouldn't necessarily divide education into, well, the mother does this part and the father does this part. But there's certainly a strong underpinning that, for example, the mother, they're the primary caregiver for a child, in that there's a connection between the mother and the child which is beyond the physical connection that it was the birth. There's a relationship which I think really supports their involvement in the child, but equally the role of the father is to contribute to that development. And this really reflects another principle in the Baha'i faith, which is the equality of men and women. And equality is often mistaken in present-day times as sameness, but it is far from that. Equality does not mean that, well, if the mother contributes 2 days a week at work, then the father must contribute 2 days at work. It's far more sophisticated than that. And I think true equality is this perfect balance where the husband and the wife, through being afforded equal opportunity to do whichever way they want to, come as part of a whole.
Thank you, Faya, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
And thank you to our viewers. We hope you enjoyed this episode. And we also hope that you will watch further episodes of Baha'i on Air. Kakite!